In this lesson, we will cover the microeconomic analysis of the effects of taxation. Specifically, we are going to look at the effects of what we call a specific tax, which is a per-unit tax. Examples of a specific tax include a cigarette tax that is $5.85 per pack, or a gas tax that is 19 cents per gallon. In both of these examples, the tax does not depend on the price, but is the same amount for each unit that is sold. An ad valorem tax is a tax that is a percentage of the price or assessed value. An example of an ad valorem tax would be a sales tax that is 8.7% of the price. The effects of an ad valorem tax are very similar to a specific tax, so the analysis for an ad valorem tax is very similar to the analysis we're going to do here for a specific tax. Let's consider the hypothetical market for a cheese pizza. This table shows the demand schedule and the supply schedule for cheese pizza. What is the equilibrium price and quantity? Here you can see that the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded at a price of $8. Let's suppose that we impose a tax on suppliers of $4. To assess the effects of this tax on suppliers, we want to derive a new supply schedule. To do this, let's first look at how much producers will supply when the price charged is $4. If producers are charging $4 after they pay a tax to the government of $4, producers are actually receiving $0. So the after-tax price that suppliers are receiving is $0. We can see that from the old supply schedule that when the after-tax price is $0, producers will supply 0 cheese pizzas. Please take a minute and figure out how much producers will supply when the price they charge is $6. If producers receive $6 from consumers and then pay a $4 tax to the government, they're actually receiving $2 net of the tax. When the price producers receive is $2, we can see from the old supply schedule that they are willing to supply 3 units. So quantity supplied will be 3 units when the price is $6. How many cheese pizzas will producers want to supply when the price they charge is $8 per pizza? The answer is 6. This is because when they charge $8 after tax, the producers are actually receiving $4. We can see in the table that at an after-tax price of $4, producers will supply 6. We can continue doing this for each of the prices that are listed in the supply schedule. And when we do this, we get this new green supply schedule. To figure out what is the new equilibrium price, we want to look at the quantity supplied in the new green supply schedule and quantity demanded in the original demand schedule, which is also now green. What is the new equilibrium price? When quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, the price is $10. The new market quantity will be 9. How much do producers receive after the tax? Producers are receiving $10 from consumers and paying a $4 tax to the government. After the tax is paid, producers actually receive $6. How much do consumers pay? Consumers will pay the market price of $10. Let's now look at this graphically. What is the effect of a tax on producers? The effect of a tax on producers will be to decrease supply. Specifically, the supply curve is shifted up by the amount of the tax. So the vertical distance between the old supply curve and the new supply curve is $4, which is the amount of the tax. The new equilibrium price, which is the price that consumers pay, is now $10, and the after-tax price received by producers is $6. Now that a $4 tax has been imposed on suppliers, what is the consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is equal to the area below the demand curve and above the price that the consumers are paying. This is shown here by the blue triangle. The area of this triangle is 1/2 times its height times its base. So consumer surplus is $27. What is producer surplus? Producer surplus is the area below the price that producers receive after tax and above the supply curve. This is also $27. What is the total amount of tax revenue collected by the government? The tax revenue is equal to the amount of the tax times the number of units taxed. The tax revenue is shown here by the orange rectangle. The height of this rectangle is the amount of the tax, and the base is the number of units taxed. The top portion of the tax revenue rectangle represents the amount of tax paid by consumers. In the free market, consumers paid a price of $8. Now that a tax has been imposed on suppliers, consumers now pay a price of $10. So consumers are paying $2 of tax on each unit they purchase. The bottom portion of the rectangle represents the amount of the tax paid by producers. In the free market with no tax, the producers were receiving $8. Now that a tax has been imposed, the producers are now receiving $6. So they are also paying $2 of tax on each unit they purchase. What is the deadweight loss from the tax? The purple area represents deadweight loss. It is equal to $6. Recall, deadweight loss is the amount by which the overall gains from trade have decreased below that which would have been possible in a competitive market where gains from trade are maximized. In the competitive free market, where 12 units are exchanged, the purple area is part of the economic surplus. Now that only 9 units are exchanged, the gains from trade represented by the purple area are not realized. What if instead of imposing the tax on producers, the government imposed the tax on consumers? What would be the effect of a $4 tax on consumers? To analyze the effect of a tax on consumers, let's first assess the effects of the tax on the demand schedule. First, consider how much will consumers buy when the price they pay is $0. If consumers must pay a price of $0 to consumers, they still have to pay $4 per unit to the government. So the after-tax price is $4. Looking at the old demand schedule, we can see that at a price of $4, the quantity demanded is 18 units. So when the price that producers charge is 0, the quantity demanded will be 18. How much will consumers buy when the price they pay is $2? If consumers are paying $2 to producers, after they pay a $4 tax to the government, they'll actually be paying $6. You can see, looking at the old demand schedule, that when the total price that they pay is $6, quantity demanded will be 15. How much will consumers buy when the price they pay is $4? If consumers are paying $4 to producers, after tax, they'll actually be paying $8. And so quantity demanded at a price of $4 will be 12. This is the new demand schedule after the $4 tax is imposed on consumers. What is the new equilibrium price? Quantity supplied equals a quantity demanded of 9 when the price is $6. How much do producers receive? The market price of $6 is paid to producers. And since they no longer have to pay a tax, producers will receive the full $6. How much do consumers pay after tax? Consumers will pay $6 to producers, then an additional $4 of tax to the government for each unit they buy. So consumers will pay a total of $10 per unit. Let's look at the effect of a tax on consumers graphically. If the government imposes a tax on consumers, demand will decrease. This is shown by a leftward shift in the demand curve. A $4 per unit tax on consumers will shift the demand curve down by $4 so that the vertical distance between the new demand curve and the old demand curve will be $4. The new equilibrium price, which is the price that producers receive, is $6. After tax, consumers are paying $10. Please take a minute and calculate the consumer surplus. Once again, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price that consumers pay. Once again, consumer surplus is $27. What is producer surplus? Producer surplus is also the same as it was before. It is the area below the price that producers receive and above the supply curve. In fact, the only thing that has changed is which curve has shifted. Whether the government imposes the tax on producers or consumers, the price that consumers pay, the price that producers receive, the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, the tax revenue, and the deadweight loss are all the same. One of the interesting lessons that we learn from our microeconomic analysis of taxation is that the incidence of tax, which in other words means who bears the tax burden, does not depend on the statutory incidence of tax or who the government charges the tax to. So you can see in both of our examples, regardless of whether the tax was imposed on producers or whether the tax was imposed on consumers, the incidence of tax, or who actually bears the tax burden, who actually ends up paying the tax, does not change. Since the incidence of tax does not depend on who the government imposes the tax on, we don't even need to shift the supply curve or the demand curve. We can use what we call the tax wedge. Since the tax amount is $4, the tax drives a wedge between the amount that the buyer pays and the seller receives by the amount of $4. This is shown in the graph by there being a $4 vertical distance between the amount that consumers pay and producers receive. Since there is a $4 tax, there has to be a $4 difference between the amount consumers pay and sellers receive. When consumers pay $10 and producers receive $6, the market is in equilibrium because quantity demanded and quantity supplied are both 9. We can also see the same consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, and deadweight loss in this graph. Who do you think would pay the tax if there was a tax imposed on insulin suppliers? Do you think producers would pay the tax? Do you think it would be split 50-50 between consumers and producers? Or do you think a large percent of the tax would actually fall on consumers? You're probably thinking, yeah, most of the tax is going to fall on consumers because consumers of insulin have to buy insulin. They really don't have much of a choice, or in other words, they're not very price sensitive. This means that demand is relatively inelastic. This graph shows a situation where demand is relatively inelastic. When we place our tax wedge in the graph, the increase in the price that consumers pay increases more than the decrease in the price producers receive. So when demand is inelastic, the incidence of tax falls disproportionately on the consumer. In the situation where consumers are not very responsive to a price change, most of the tax gets pushed on to the consumer. Now let's look at a situation where consumers are very price sensitive, or in other words, when the elasticity of demand is fairly elastic. You can see that when we drive a tax wedge between supply and demand, quantity supplied will equal quantity demanded at a point where the price the buyer pays hasn't gone up by much, whereas the price that the producer receives has gone down by quite a bit. So when the demand is relatively elastic, we expect the incidence of tax will fall disproportionately on the producer. Let's now do our analysis with different elasticities of supply. Specifically, let's first look at a situation where supply is relatively inelastic. Here we have drawn the supply curve, so it is less elastic than the demand. When we impose a tax wedge between the price the buyer pays and the price the seller receives, you can see that the price that the buyer pays hasn't gone up by much compared to the amount that the price the seller receives has gone down. When supply is relatively inelastic, the incidence of tax falls disproportionately on the producer. How about when supply is elastic? Here you can see that when we drive a tax wedge between the amount the buyer pays and the seller receives, that the increase in the price paid by the consumer is greater than the decrease in the price received by the producer. The second lesson of taxation is that the incidence of tax depends on the elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand. Specifically, the incidence of tax falls more heavily on the less elastic party. So in each of these 4 examples, the less elastic party, or the party that was less responsive to a price change, got hit with the greater tax burden. So it doesn't matter who the government imposes the tax on. Who pays the tax actually is determined by the relative elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand. The less elastic party is going to pay the greater portion of the tax, regardless of who the government charges the tax to. Let's go back to our market for cheese pizza and explore how the market finds equilibrium when there is a tax. Suppose the tax is $4 and producers insist on receiving the original free market price of $8. If producers are receiving $8 after tax, quantity supplied will be 12. Since producers receive $8 after the tax is paid, it must be that consumers are paying $12. This would imply that quantity demanded is 6. So this implies that there is a surplus of 6. This analysis is for a competitive market where we have many suppliers competing against each other and many buyers. If there is a surplus of 6, the producers will have an incentive to lower price so that they can be competitive and sell more. As price decreases, quantity supplied will decrease and quantity demanded will increase until quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. This equilibrium will take place where the price consumers pay is $10 and the price that producers receive is $6. The same market forces that drove equilibrium in a free market without a tax drive the market to equilibrium with a tax.